Welcome to our 5th episode of SleepLab with Netzer and Popovich. In the last episode, we showed you how things work in the SleepLab and how sleep is then evaluated in 30-second intervals. These 30-second intervals are set by the computer. You don't have to do it manually anymore. The computer then combines them into a sleep profile, which we'll later see in a look at the graphic. Rainer, honestly, you know, and can explain why the intervals are 30 seconds, right? You've been with us for so long.
I hope you're not referring to my age or my work in the sleep lab, but I'd be happy to answer your question. In fact, I was already working with computers in a sleep lab in Austria when I was still working with I worked with a recorder that recorded on paper. The company Grass, as anyone working in that field will know. And this recorder distinguished itself by the fact that a continuous sheet of paper of a precisely predefined length was pulled through from a roll, and the recordings at a paper speed of 25 millimeters per second resulted in exactly one 30-second epoch per sheet. And those who analyzed it then analyzed these epochs that followed each other by 30 seconds.
Well, I can still remember it quite well myself. I remember visiting my colleagues in the sleep lab in Freiburg in the psychiatry and neurology departments in the early 1990s. They are even more precise than we pulmonologists, to be honest. And back then, they were literally sitting there with a ruler and have practically measured what I showed in the last episode, namely these current curves with each individual wave. I think that's unimaginable today, given the time period. That would be impossible.
The time required for this is, of course, immeasurable. This works for individual examinations or research studies, but not in routine everyday life. And what I haven't mentioned yet, the wonderful thing about the computers we use is that the recording is completely silent. Whereas these Grass recorders were extremely loud devices that prevented observers in sleep laboratories from sleeping. This means that one inevitably stayed awake because of the needle fluctuations, especially if the patient moved, for example.
Yes, just like in the old earthquake disaster movies.
Exactly, they were extremely loud and would have woken you up from any sleeping position if you were an observer.
But what this actually looks like in reality, so to speak, nowadays, we will now look at again in the sleep laboratory in Bolzano. Yes, in the last episode, we briefly mentioned the sleep problem. But Heike, now you can explain to us right here on the computer how the sleep profile is composed from what you evaluated and what picture emerges from it.
Okay. I've now evaluated 935 pages individually, as we said, in 30-second epochs. And that results in this so-called hypnogram. Here we see the sleep onset phase starting from being awake, then he goes into light sleep.
How long is the sleep onset phase?
The sleep onset phase for him was about 10 to 20 minutes. So not that long, you know.
So normal?
Completely normal. And then he enters light sleep, here into stable light sleep, and then here into deep sleep. This is one sleep cycle with the REM sleep here at the end. These are the thick bars. And this here is the REM sleep. And this repeats from time to time. You have short waking phases in between, but that's also completely normal. If it's not a very long waking phase, you hardly remember it. And then you cycle back into your normal light sleep, and then into deep sleep, briefly awake, REM sleep, and so it repeats itself the whole time. What's interesting to observe is that deep sleep is actually rarely found in the last third of the night. In the last third of the night, this REM sleep occurs more frequently. You can confirm that, right?
Yes. So, of course, it's quite clear. We have, and we always call the individual sections. This is practically a sleep period, so to speak, right? And we actually see with this patient, if I look at the bars for REM, we see about 4 periods, 4 sleep periods, which is also completely normal. So this is what normal sleep would look like. And REM sleep, it doesn't just get longer, Heike, but
more frequent too.
Yes, and more intense.
You have more dreams.
And how can you tell that the REM sleep is becoming more intense?
That you can remember the dreams, but only if you stay awake for a while. You're probably familiar with the phenomenon. You wake up, think, wow, I have to tell my partner this dream. And poof, it's gone when you wake up again in the morning. You know you've dreamed, but the content is just blown away. And that, yes, can be very intense, especially towards the morning.
Yes. But I think maybe we should briefly mention this as an evaluation criterion for these more intense REM sleep phases. We have more eye movements.
Right?
At the beginning of the night, there are often just one or two, which isn't so easy to recognize. For a layperson, a professional can, of course, but then at the end of the night, even a layperson could actually see it from the many eye movements. Yes,
that's actually true.
Okay, so here we have practically our absolutely textbook perfect normal sleep profile.
That's how we want to see it.
So as we saw in Bolzano, that would be a normal sleep. We wanted to learn how to do that with an ordinary person too. So Heike now has this epochs and phases are combined. Now, of course, we need to orient ourselves to the parameters we have in order to then assess the sleep profile. Ultimately, we want to see if someone has enough dream sleep, artificial sleep, and deep sleep. And in order to determine that, we have the following parameters. On the one hand, there's the time spent in bed. So we basically bring our person to bed and start measuring. And then, of course, the time when we turn off the lights. These are important indicators, but what is absolutely crucial for how we assess sleep is the amount of time the person has spent sleeping. And we call that the total sleep time, or TST in technical terms. And as I said, we have TST for total sleep time and TIB for time in bed. And Rainer is now telling us why we have a problem understanding this without sleep.
This is precisely the point where the major difference between ambulatory monitoring recordings with simple 8 channels and those in a sleep lab becomes clear. As is well known, in the sleep lab we have the EEG, which we record and which is essential for assessing the sleep stages. The EEG is not normally recorded in these simple outpatient examinations. Therefore, we do not have precise insight into how long the patient slept, at what stage, and how long the periods of wakefulness in between were. We can only infer this indirectly from the recorded curves, for example, if movements occur or similar events where we assume the patient was briefly awake. So that's the big difference between the EEG and the EEG. Records from the sleep lab and the ambulatory devices show that with the ambulatory devices, we usually have no knowledge at all of how long and in which stages the person slept.
And now we'll take a closer look at the graphic to see what a normal sleep profile looks like. On the one hand, what percentage of the time we spend in deep sleep, what percentage in REM sleep, and what percentage in light sleep. And we'll compare that with the profile of a sleep apnea patient with disturbed sleep.
In contrast to the upper sleep profile in the graphic, which was already discussed in the previous episode, in the lower sleep profile of a sleep apnea patient, there is practically no deep sleep or dream sleep, and the sleep is interrupted by periods of wakefulness.
And that's exactly the point where I'd like to mention one more thing: sleep onset, or the time of sleep onset. This means when do we have the first epoch of sleep that we assess, and how much time has passed between turning the lights out and this first sleep stage. And precisely this, the so-called sleep onset time, is very important for diagnosing certain sleep disorders, particularly narcolepsy.
And now, let's look at this whole process more visually in another graphic showing when we fall asleep and when we dream. We can see that right here in this graphic.
The night begins with a short period of falling asleep, from a few minutes up to a maximum of 20 minutes of wakefulness, before you enter light sleep stage 1. In this first sleep phase, involuntary electrical discharges in the muscles often cause the legs to twitch. Don't be alarmed, that's normal. Then you quickly move into deep sleep, sleep stage 3. If a friend wakes us with a phone call or by ringing the doorbell in this phase, it takes longer for us to wake up, and we often don't know where we are. Sleepwalking can also occur in this phase. Via a lighter sleep stage 2, we reach the first REM phase. We can't remember the dreams in this phase unless someone wakes us up. After that, another deep sleep phase follows. The deep sleep phases in the first half of the night are important for the formation of our immune system, our digestion and processing of food, and for the recovery of the heart and other muscles. In the second half of the night, light sleep phases alternate with REM, rapid eye movement phases, or dream sleep. The latter become longer and more intense. If we wake up from this phase, we can often remember our dreams. Regardless of whether it's a nightmare or a sexual dream, a spontaneous erection often occurs in both men and women. This has nothing to do with the content of the dream. Sometimes the erection still lasts for a short time after we've already woken up. The REM sleep phases are important for the consolidation of our memory. We are practically writing from the RAM to the hard drive. Unimportant things are deleted, important things are stored for longer. After 6 to 7 hours, when our wake-up hormones adrenaline, dopamine, and cortisol rise again, we wake up.
All right, so the question naturally arises, to experience these cycles, do we really have to sleep for 6 or 7 hours every time? In that regard, one must also know that this 6 or 7 hours of sleep wasn't always the normal way humans slept throughout history. We actually used to sleep for shorter and longer periods. You can easily imagine this. Just think, you're not a person in our modern industrial society, but you're still, so to speak, in the Stone Age, or you're living up in a tree and always have to be careful that nothing happens. Then, of course, you're more likely to sleep whenever you can and be awake when you can't. For elite athletes who do extreme sports and for soldiers who are at war, it's a similar situation to one we thought we had overcome in our evolution, namely having to sleep in short bursts again and again. And as many studies on such individuals have shown, as I said, either military personnel or, let's take for example the round-the-world sailor Boris Herrmann or other extreme athletes, it's been demonstrated that when we take short naps, like a siesta, then after a certain training period, it doesn't happen overnight, you have to practice it a bit. We still go through all the sleep stages even in that short phase. For example, during a half-hour or 2-hour nap, we go through them, just as we showed earlier in the picture in the graphic.
It is also possible in the SleepLab to measure states of sexual arousal during the night with special sensors. And that can be interesting and important when a patient is wondering whether their impotence has organic causes.
The kissing lips that we saw earlier in the graphic.
Exactly, the kissing lips at the end of the graphic. Everyone will wonder what that has to do with waking up. And it's also interesting why it's shown in the morning. That's because the morning, of course, has one of the longest REM periods, that is with REM sleep. Then when you can measure such states of sexual arousal using special sensors, you can differentiate between organically caused states of impotence in men or psychological ones, for example, due to stress.
But Rainer, it's hardly used anymore, one must say. There are some countries like Israel, for example, where it's still done very often. Here it's actually less common because a bit of trial and error with Viagra is cheaper and easier. But it would actually be a good method to do this in the SleepLab as well, or how do you see it?
It's true that nowadays it's no longer requested or assigned for this purpose. But back when I started, and you probably did too, it was on everyone's lips, and it was strongly recommended to move this type of differential diagnosis for sexual disorders into the SleepLab. But as you rightly say, nowadays that practice has completely fallen by the wayside and is uncommon.
Good. What hasn't fallen by the wayside, of course, is the diagnosis of sleep apnea, the most common sleep-related medical condition. And so far, we have focused very heavily on neurology and the neurophysiological channels, which we refer to as the electroencephalogram, electromyogram, and the electrooculogram. And now, in the next episode, we want to look at what's going on with our respiratory channels. And well, we'll see you then, and bye for now.
And sweet dreams.